G'day you mob, and welcome to this episode of Aussie English, the number one podcast for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English and wrap their head around Australian culture, history, news and current affairs, all that jazz. Anyway, today's a great episode, guys. Today I get to have a chinwag with author Nick Brodie about his book 1787, The Long Chapters of Australia's Beginnings. So this is all about the earlier interactions with Indigenous Australians, as well as the Maori and the New Guineans to the north of the continent, with explorers from places like Spain, Portugal, Holland, and Britain and France, obviously. And this is all before the year 1788, when the first fleet arrived to Australia and Australia was officially colonised. So I recently finished this book and I sent out an invitation on Instagram to Nick to come on the show. And today, he obliged me. So Nick has a doctorate in late medieval vagrancy. He's worked as a field archaeologist, taught at a university for a decade, and now writes a growing suite of acclaimed popular histories and is a self-professed professional history nerd. So we had an amazing chat today, guys. The conversation went in many different directions, but we eventually got to 1787, his book, and these interesting interactions between all these explorers and the Indigenous communities of Australia, New Zealand, and New Guinea. Anyway, without any further ado, guys, kick the bird and let's get into it. Nick Brodie, welcome to the podcast. How are you going?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So, we were just sort of chatting about how I stumbled across your book, 1787, recently and wanted to get you on the podcast. And obviously, you wrote that a few years ago, but I assume that you can still remember the basics.
I can remember the basics, yeah. If you give me names and vague dates, that'll prompt the old memory.
Exactly. Well, before we get into that, can you tell me a bit about where you grew up? And where you're from?
I was born in Wagga Wagga, actually. So I'm living in Tassie at the minute.
Yep.
But I was born in Wagga Wagga in country New South Wales and grew up in the little country town of Junee, which is about half an hour away, right on the edge of town. So real country boy. Growing up, went to uni in Canberra, did history and archaeology there, worked for a bit in Canberra afterwards before then moving to Tassie to do my PhD in 16th century English law for the regulation of beggary, vagabondage and poor relief, which is not very marketable. So I've written a few Aussie history books since then.
Well, what did that entail? Because I was looking that up, medieval vagrancy, right?
Yeah. So basically the thesis involved going and looking at the laws from 1495 to 1572 specifically, as they evolve for regulating beggary, vagabondage and poor relief. In other words, how the welfare states started to develop in that period, how the poor were kept in check and controlled through the use of vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws are great. They're like the anti-terrorism laws of their day. They involve summary judgment, so you just have to slap somebody down with it. You don't have to go to court and go through any of that sort of process. So that's why Henry VIII loved it. These autocratic regimes love those sorts of laws. And I looked at how they were implemented in a couple of the major county towns, so York, Norwich, Exeter and Bristol. And that involved basically reading the laws very closely to get a sense of how they interacted within themselves and responded. They changed over time and what was prompting that change from a legal perspective. And then looking at how they were implemented in these county towns to see, well, making the law was one thing, but is it actually ever implemented is another question entirely. So I sort of followed that as well.
Did that tie in at all with how things kind of ramped up throughout the 1700s to then lead to a lot of these laws coming in that punished people who stole things and sent them to colonies like Australia?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a law in 1547. The 1547 Slavery Act, it's called, popularly, but it's just one of these laws for the regulation of vagrancy, and it implemented compulsory work as punishment for vagrancy. And as part of that, so most of these laws, they involved, if you were caught outside of your county town, where you belong, where you grew up, then it had a mechanism for shipping you back.
Yep.
You'd be passed from officer to officer back to your own county. You'd be whipped along the way or given letters to beg. There's all sorts of things. But this one in particular took that a step further and basically made people slaves for a period of set number of years as punishment for vagrancy. And so you have in that law, in this sort of time frame, the actual mechanisms that grew into convict transportation, this idea that once a person's been punished, then they can be moved from one spot to another through chains of custody and then forced to work as their punishment.
And it was very difficult.
Grew out of this period.
It was very difficult, though, right, back then, because they had such class warfare in Britain, and you effectively were, at least if you're in the lower class, quite often forced into a position where you might have to break some of these menial laws, stealing a rabbit from its warren or whatever it is that, in order to feed your family. And then you're effectively tarnished with criminality for the rest of your life, right? Once a criminal, always a criminal, and, lower class scum. So it must have been a pretty hard life during that period, I can imagine.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly easy for the poor people. You wouldn't consider them model laws that we'd implement today. They did literally mark people. I mean, that's slavery law that I just mentioned. It has a whole paragraph about how to mark a person's ear, because this is in a world before lots of paperwork and the surveillance state as it exists now. It didn't exist then, but they were sort of creeping towards that. One of the ways is you literally mark a person's body. So you chop off a certain part of their ear, and if it's got that mark, then they've been punished for that crime. And then if they're caught again, well, it's off to the scaffold, that sort of thing. So that whole apparatus of punishment not only sort of culturally marks you as a criminal forever, but physically.
It's really interesting our history with convictry, right? Because I recently read Robert Hughes's book, and I was thinking originally that, from what I was taught at school, convicts had it pretty easy. They came to Australia and then it was pretty much smooth sailing from there. They did their time and it was all good, but it seemed to be a much more brutal kind of existence, right? But the interesting thing that Robert Hughes was talking about was that a lot of people now look at it as slavery, but he wouldn't describe it as slavery because you at least had the capacity to earn your freedom by the end of the sort of period that you were serving. How do you think, I guess, convictry is portrayed today versus how it was back in the period? Yeah,
that's a very difficult question, and it really depends upon the perspective that the writers come at. So if you look at it structurally, the comparison with slavery is pretty obvious. And so I think it's fair to make that comparison. But yes, it's not the same thing. Slavery involves intergenerational people being property. So it's a completely different order. But in terms of its day-to-day practicalities, you can see why people at the time thought of it as slavery, and the convicts in particular thought of it as slavery, especially because a lot of their labour then fed into making other people really rich.
Yes.
So here in Tasmania, for instance, where I'm sitting, there are some big families, big, powerful political families who are the descendants of the convict owning class, if you will, the ones who had convicts and made a lot of money through having that cheap labour. So that late 20th century narrative of convictism as being pretty easy and good for people in the long run, I think is much more to do with Australia's resurgent sense of nationalism come, bicentenary than it's got anything to do with.
Well, that was kind of what I guess I wanted to get to in terms of my grandparents would never have, their generation would never have admitted to having convicts in their heritage, and let alone be proud of it. They would, sweep it under the rug, try and hide it. It's all hush hush. I guess maybe because there would have been people in there when they were kids that were still alive who would have known convicts or had convicts in the family. But nowadays it seems to be something like with Ned Kelly, where if you can draw some sort of connection to that person, or you're like, yes, I've got convict blood, there's criminal blood in me. Do you find it really bizarre that in only 2 generations it's kind of done a complete backflip and people are now proud of that?
Yeah, it's fascinating, but it sort of makes a bit of sense. It's a way of people having that deeper connection to time. It's enough generations have passed that you don't feel you're necessarily tainted with the crimes. Although I deal with a lot of family historians tracing their ancestry in Tasmania, and they're all looking for convicts, basically. They tend to be looking for convicts or an Aboriginal ancestor. And of the convict ones, there are all sorts of interesting prejudices that come through there. So they all think that their person probably just stole a hanky and was unfairly transported for some petty little crime. And some of them were shockers.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of convicts in my tree.
Really?
And some of them were small scale thieves, trying to just pay for a loaf of bread. But, one of them was transported for treason in Ireland, although, that's politics. But there are some who are transported for murder and manslaughter and rape and all sorts of really nasty things. So there's this kind of overwhelming narrative that has grown to the fore that all of the convicts were hard done by. Not all of them were. So I think people need to be a bit careful that if you go looking, you might find things that you didn't want to find.
Is that a sort of difficult thing when you are a historian? Because I guess people have these rose-coloured glasses when looking back on the history. We were talking about this earlier today when we were having a chat before the call. But I think you wrote in the book here, storytellers have often fallen into mistaken cliches of mutual unintelligibility. And I think you wrote, depending on the political leanings of the author, it's either proto-modern Europeans fighting prehistoric people or the arrogant, self-styled, civilized white man meeting culturally diverse advanced societies he fails to appreciate it, in terms of obviously Europeans coming into contact with Indigenous people. But what sort of role does the way in which authors and historians, the way in which they have prejudices and biases influence the way that we then report and perceive history?
Yeah. Well, we've all got biases and we've all got our own personal bents. And, it's often your bias that will determine the book you go to write. But I think what has happened in a couple of generations of Australian historical writing is that there's a market feedback loop almost where people buy the books that they're predisposed to get the story that they want. And so in a way, the market plays back to that. So some of those works rise to the fore to serve that particular need. There are people in Australian history who, because they didn't study Indigenous history, for instance, in the mid-20th century, if they were going through the school in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they will often tell me as a historian that we never studied this, we never learned this, this is all new to us. And some of that's fair enough, some of that is, the research moves forward and there have been new discoveries since then. But a lot of that was available to them then, but they just chose not to engage with it. So there's a cultural shift that's going on there, and they're dressing it up as a way history has changed. And the reverse is true as well. You kind of get a reactionary approach where you get these books about explorers, for instance. And we've known for decades and decades and decades that most of the inland explorers in Australian history had Aboriginal guides with them, whole teams of them. Like the explorer is not really an explorer. He's just
you'd be a moron, right? You'd be an idiot not to have any, right? Just I'll do it. I'll be fine. What could happen?
Exactly, and it's not just about geography. It's about the cultural negotiation that goes with that. So that as you move from one mob's area to another mob's area, you don't run into trouble by making some catastrophic faux pas. You need somebody there to help you with it. But still, that sort of complexity will occasionally get written out of Australian history. I get horrified when I see books about explorers and they don't even have Aboriginal people in the index, which is a reaction to that other sort. I think we're just very polarised.
Does it happen both ways though? Because I have this oversense, this feeling now that we kind of make out, say, Indigenous history to be a lot more Eden-like, and everything was perfect, and then white men came and the place just went to hell. Whereas I feel like the more I sort of dig into it now, like that seems to be the sense I get from the media and from online and the average person that I'll chat to. Indigenous people were living in heaven and we came and destroyed the place. And the more you read into it, it seems like, guys, the reality seems to be so much more complex than that. That, you had a lot of these people coming from Britain to Australia who were colonists, who were convicts, but many of them, if not the majority, didn't want to be here. And they had their own, the convicts were effectively slaves. They were forced to come here. The Indigenous people obviously didn't want them to be here, wanted their own land, but they were also doing things, having wars with each other, fighting each other. They were fighting with white men were fighting with them. So it seems to be a lot more complex than just, here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. This is how you need to interpret history if you want to be, on the right side of history. How do you feel about that today?
Well, I agree entirely. I mean, I like to follow the evidence. I like to follow what the historical evidence says, and you can try and interpret that as best you can with your training, with more evidence, with looking at what other people have done. But there is a tendency, I agree, to take these sorts of ideas to the nth degree,
Yeah.
to in a way right back against history again, like this idea that Aboriginal people were just savages prompted the next generation of people to write about how they were advanced cultures,
Yeah.
which then prompts the next group of people to come along and say, well, come on, white people weren't all bad or weren't all so bad as you've said, which then prompts the next ones to come along and find horrible cases of things that they did. And it just goes on and on as a political cycle. It's very much like the North American politics, Republicans and Democrats, and they can never agree.
Did you see what Biden said recently? If you vote for Trump, you're not black.
Yeah, I saw that.
It's like, oh man, are we really playing this game? Jesus. Like,
and of course that faceplant moment, the whole team then immediately thinking, why did he say that? Because now we're talking about this rather than what we really should be talking about. And I think that's what Australian history is really badly prone to. As a kind of a profession, it's a small profession, relatively speaking.
Yep.
So we get stuck into these pitched camps that are having inane self-referential arguments with each other, and not really progressing things forward by looking at new questions, new stories, and new ways of looking at the things we used to look at. So we kind of have agreed narratives, but different interpretations of those narratives, which I think is a big problem in Australian history.
It is so frustrating too, because it seems like, we enter this, at least currently, this, social justice kind of stage now, which, has good side to it and a bad side to it. But it seems like it sets the stage for, you need to carry that narrative if you want to release a book or you want to release a film, because no one's going to buy it otherwise. Right. And so that's kind of like a big prejudice or influence on the stuff that does get released. And, ultimately, like you, I have a background in science. I did my PhD in evolutionary biology, and it was much more just show me the evidence and I'll, try and interpret that as unbiased, as I can. And I would much prefer that with history. It's like, you don't need to tell me at the end of the story, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy. It's kind of like lay out the facts, allow the complexity to be there, good or bad. One good example recently was Buckley, right? I read Adam Courtney's book on the Ghost and the Bounty Hunter. And it's like Buckley was at the end of his life, obviously playing both sides, trying to save the Indigenous people and prevent them from being massacred by white people, and also prevent the white people. But it was like, you can't win in that situation, right? But the complexity was sort of the beautiful side of that story, as opposed to Buckley was evil or Buckley was good or, whatever. But
yeah, I take a very Catholic approach to that whole question. The strict, 17th century Calvinists would have us as good or bad. Whereas the Catholic approach is more that, well, we're all sinners and we all do good things and bad things. And so we're all capable of that sort of nuance and complexity. And I think that is another one of those issues in Australian history, is that these narratives about some particular characters are really big. So if I can just mention Governor Arthur, we were talking about in chat earlier, in Van Diemen's Land. Now, he's a fellow who's got this reputation as a benign, well-meaning, but slightly inept administrator.
Yep.
There's generations of historians have written about him that way. But it's basically because they go to the same books and they go to the same sources and they check them against each other. And so of course they're going to come up with roughly the same narrative. But when I went off into the archives looking at what he actually did and what other people hadn't looked at, I found him agreeing to pay bounties on dead Aboriginal people. This is a person who's capable of committing an act of genocide. That's the only way you could describe that particular one. That's not a bumbling, inept, well-meaning guy. That's a ruthless career administrator, which makes sense. The instant you think about it, this is a guy who went to Jamaica. Hardly the most. That's a very politically nuanced sort of environment for an administrator going to in that period. And then he goes to Canada, and in Canada he ships some convicts here, some North Americans, rebels they get described as. Some of them Canadians, some are actually Americans invading Canada, but he ships them here. Like he's quite a hard man than he needs to be, as most of those sort of political types are. And I think one of the issues is that the historians fall in love with and project sometimes onto their characters, if you will, their own characteristics. And that's why they're so, as I mentioned earlier, biographies are so often, the lone genius who's misunderstood in their own time. That's the narrative underlying.
Does it get very difficult though? Because obviously it's all finished. It's all written in stone when we go back into history and try and write these stories about people. And so is it difficult for those people writing it because they come upon something that's finished? They look at the final, like who was he at the end of his life? And then they decide, okay, so he was evil, he was good, and they paint the story that way, as opposed to a more complex character that was obviously a baby once, that was innocent, and then had an entire life where they probably turned at some point one way or the other and had to make certain decisions. Is that a big issue too?
I'd say from my experience, what tends to happen is within about a generation of a person's death, their story has been, and we're talking famous people here, the kind of history makers, if you will, in a traditional sense, they tend to get characterized into a narrative structure in the generation after their prominence. The first people to write the history of that person reduce them to a historical character. And that's often the one that sticks, because the next historian is going to come along and read that history first as the entree into that person's life. And you can see that with all sorts of characters in Australian colonial history.
Well, three really good ones globally would be things like Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and Nelson Mandela, right? Where it's kind of like they're all written as heroes today. And then you go and look into what some of the acts that they did, and you're kind of like, Nelson Mandela was supporting people blowing up hospitals and killing children. And you're just like, we should have the maturity to at least be able to understand the circumstances a little more widely, right? With Mother Teresa trying to help people because of her Catholic belief, but at the same time allowing people to die of diseases that were preventable because she was hoping that they would get into heaven by praying and not going to doctors. And you're kind of like, it's a shame that we just get one story constantly, because this is the sort of socially agreed upon narrative now.
We tend to lose context. So that's one issue, is that people are always being judged against our present standards. And that's just unavoidable. But the best we can do is hold that in mind, I think. So much so, I think most people wouldn't realise Gandhi even lived in South Africa at some point.
And how racist he was, right?
did anything there. The other one is the capacity for change, that nuance that's, people do develop. I like to think that I'm a better person than I was when I was a late teen, for instance. We all have that sort of capacity to change and grow and degenerate. People slip the other way. So in history, people, and I see this all the time, especially in academic papers, people decide whether a person is a goodie or a bad.
Yeah.
And then that tends to frame the way that they tell that person's story and investigate it. And if they find something that sticks out as proof that they're on the other side to whatever it is that they've decided, and they'll often ignore it, downplay it, or try to argue it away.
It is so funny how much human nature is kind of, it imprints upon everything like that, on science, on history. It's all about, I have this feeling, and we need to teach ourselves to be a bit more unbiased, I guess, and sort of like, I have this feeling inside of me, I want this to be the case, but it's like, that doesn't make it the case. You have to go in and investigate things. Anyway, let's get on to 1787. What motivated you to write this as I think it was your second book, right?
Basically because I was a little bit embarrassed about what Australian history was on offer in a New Zealand bookstore when I was travelling in Dunedin. I went to look. I got a thing about looking at the bookshelves, history bookshelves. I mean, if you're going to be a writer, that's what you've got to do. You kind of keep an eye on what the market's doing and what other people are doing, and try to work out an interesting new way of getting yourself on that shelf. And what I thought was, well, this is some pretty turgid stuff.
What was on the shelf? You don't have to give us the names, but the type of thing.
The type of thing is, well, let's say Captain Cook discovered Australia.
Yes.
The first fleet started Australia. And Aboriginal Australia was absolutely the same for 40,000 years before European arrival, and I know that because I've looked at some 19th century explorers' journals. That's and I just intellectually, I found that frustrating as well. So on the one hand, there's a clear market gap that these stories of Indigenous Australia and exploration are told quite distinctly from each other. They're not really integrated terribly well, at least up front. It's there in the background sometimes, but it's not really acknowledged as a way of approaching both of those areas. And another one is that problem of how do you do that history? How do you do that history on the very edge where a literate culture is engaging with a non-literate culture and is therefore producing the documentary evidence that you can use it. I mean, I'm trained in archaeology as well, so I'm well aware of the archaeological package, the anthropological, and that Indigenous perspectives are changing the way we do history and all of that. Like, I'm well aware of all of that. But I think fundamentally with the discipline of history, where you look at text and use that as the core of what you do, there was a bit of a problem in Australia's early narratives, such that's why we constantly fall back into that idea that Australian history starts with Cook or Arthur Phillip, because that's when the documentary trail starts. And I knew that the documentary trail started earlier, and it sort of blurs from this vague stuff in the deeper past into a much more clear picture by the time that European settlement is starting, kind of moving forward aggressively. So I already had an understanding that, well, there's a book in that. There's this story of not just of European powers moving into Australia, but of Australia coming into better resolution over time during these centuries.
And so what made you decide to include, when you were talking about the different Indigenous interactions with Europeans, places like New Guinea and New Zealand as well as Australia?
Because I think we have a very Australian-centric view of Australian history, fundamentally. It's very anachronistic. If you think of Australia as an island nation, then it begs the question, why do you include Tasmania or Norfolk Islands? And if you're going to include them, why not include New Guinea and New Zealand? New Zealand was administered from Australia to start with. New Guinea was administered from Australia much later on. So they're all connected, even in that very strict narrative sense of Australian history. But even earlier on, I think it's quite crucial to understanding what happens here and why it happens and the way it happens, to look at a bigger frame. If you only ever look at England and then the east coast of Australia, then of course you're going to end up with a very binary sort of history. So I was looking for something more nuanced and a bit harder, I suppose.
And so who were the first people to come in contact with Indigenous people in this region, I guess, including all of the surrounding Australian islands and New Zealand and New Guinea?
Well, it basically depends on where you draw the line and who you're looking at. But the two major players are the Dutch and the Spanish Empire. Both are arriving, they both have documentary encounters with Indigenous Australians in 1606. So that's what I use as the starting point. There is the possibility of earlier contact, but this is sort of the moment when Australia really dips into the documentary horizon of Europe's empires, and therefore we can follow. I actually started with the Spanish expedition of de Prado. Well, it's actually de Quiros de Prado de Torres. These guys are coming from South America, heading towards the Spanish Philippines, and the Dutch actually go through before them, I think from memory. But I really wanted to start with them to break the mold of coming from Europe to Australia, to look at Australia in the larger frame of the Pacific, the larger frame of those empires moving around the world. It's sort of the last major region that the European powers are starting to move into. And you can only understand that by understanding that they were already going places before they encountered here. They sort of move here by accident and slowly over time, because they've got much more interest in that already interconnected world. The trade with China, Eurasia is one massive block, including Africa. They're also part of a cultural world. And then North America the Central Americas quickly becomes that as well. And so this is the last of those major cultural blocks. And it's in a part because of that highly localised tribal cultures to Australia's north, acts as a bit of a buffer and slows the whole process down. So they're all getting there at about that same time, and that's when the story really can be told. It's obviously not the moment that Australia's history starts, but history as traditionally done through documentary means can start in earnest then.
And was it De Prado and Quiros who arrived in New Guinea and had interactions with the locals where I wasn't sure, I can't remember off the top of my head if this was the case, but they realised that the locals recognised the guns as well?
Yeah, as they get closer, so they start to see signs, and that's one of the really interesting things, again, about that voyage, that they're in New Guinea, and as they're moving up through the west of New Guinea towards the Philippines, they start to have people know what guns are to start with. People have objects which appear to be of Chinese manufacture.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon they're starting to encounter people who can speak their language, at least rudimentarily. So that you gradually move into their a familiar cultural world, and it shows that bleeding of culture and encounter, and that's what I like about that voyage, because it's a gradual movement from those encounters in the Pacific where they might have met people whose grandparents might have had an earlier encounter, but that would be it. To these ones where they're sort of quite familiar parts of that world.
And so what was happening on the west coast? It seemed like, so De Queiroz, Torres, they went through the Torres Strait, obviously named after Torres in the end. They were at least believed to be some of the first people to navigate through there and map it. But then we had the Dutch hitting the west coast quite a lot, right, going to Batavia. And what were the sorts of interactions that those guys, I think Jan Zoom, was he the first one to hit the west coast to have interactions with Indigenous people?
Yeah, so the very first Dutch ones basically come down from the top, but the rest of them are part of that sweep through. So they come round the bottom of South Africa, and then they shoot across the Indian Ocean, and they hit the Australian landmass and go up.
Yep.
And they're making a guessing game, basically. They don't want to get too close to the shore before they turn up, because they have no interest in Australia. The first couple of encounters, they see it as desert. It's not. There's no spices here, basically. There's no gold, no spices. Certainly nobody we can trade with, and trade's our thing. So that's the Dutch mentality about the western coast. It looms very large in the cartographical telling of Australia. When people talk about how Australia is mapped, the Dutch have a huge place in that story, because of course they were very actively charting it, because they didn't want to hit it. But they didn't really engage culturally much at all. So that for my telling of it, the Dutch are of much less significance.
I guess for the context there, the Dutch were doing it, not the Dutch per se, but the VOC, right? The Dutch East India Company was the one driving this.
Exactly, who have a first fleet. Even the way we tell Australians history comes from, in a way, borrowing the Dutch first fleet. They had a first fleet that went to the Indies, which then set it up. The Doifken was one of those ships, which is the first of the Dutch ships in 1606 to get to Cape York. So it's all kind of interconnected with the telling of history.
So what were the interactions like, though? Because they would have known people were there, right? Because they saw smoke on the horizon. Did the Dutch, I mean, we can get on to Dampier shortly, but did the Dutch actually have any one-to-one interactions with Indigenous people on the West Coast, or they only just saw the smoke, were like, people are there, landed, no one was, they were all hiding, not wanting to have any interactions? What were the sort of situations?
They had some attempted ones. So again, it's been a few years since I've written this, but from memory, the Dutch are mostly non-encounters.
Yeah,
and that's very clear in Tasmania. Tasman comes here in 1640, and he famously sees signs of people everywhere. And makes assumptions about how big they are based on notches and trees, which we now know climb in to catch possum. But he just assumes they're giants. And so, even though he doesn't actually meet anybody, he sees smoke, he sees fire, he sees middens, he sees tools, he sees this, he sees that. But what he writes about people he did not encounter
Yes.
prejudices everybody who comes subsequently. And the Dutch are very much like that. So overall, the Dutch don't really have a lot of contact. In the north, with the Deutschen, they do. There's a violent contact there. So it's pretty much a usual pattern everywhere you go. But sometimes there's a bit of friendly, if wary, trade or contact or communication, often violence. And that's sort of normal for human history worldwide, you know. You can see the same things with the Vikings in North America a good half a millennium earlier. But the Dutch are sort of non-entities in the history of European, Australian Indigenous encounters for that reason, that it's very pared down and more of a non-encounter than, you know, a deep. You know, people like Dampier and Cook and the French have much more engaged encounters, and so they sort of tell us a lot more about the Indigenous cultures of the time that they're encountering, as well as the nature of the Frenchmen and the Englishmen who are doing the encountering.
Well, I found that really interesting that you mentioned, I think, several times the next lot of discoverers, explorers, or sailors to come through were often prejudiced by the writings and the work of the people who'd come before them, because obviously there would have been very little information, and you would have been a moron not to try and do a bit of research on the area, I take it. But it was really interesting to realize how prejudiced people's views were based on the people who'd come beforehand. So I think you mentioned that Cook had read, Dampier and Tasman had read Dampier, and Dampier had read the Dutch, accounts. Can you touch on what happened with Dampier on the West Coast and his really interesting interaction and just story, because he came twice, right?
Yeah. So Dampier's great. Dampier has a couple of elements to his story. One is that he comes twice. Another is that he writes both of them up for public consumption.
I love that it was ego-driven, right?
Yeah, he's definitely ego-driven. He's making a name for himself. He's a bit of a nobody who makes a splash, and we all now remember his name because of that. He's the celebrity sailor of his day. So you've got the resolution that comes from having two voyages, but the complication of having somebody who's deliberately writing to try and make himself famous and make money out of writing these stories up, which means he's then much more likely to be read by the next people to come along. And so his encounters and his prejudices probably disproportionately affect how people subsequently think. So one of the things that Dampier does, he ends up in a firefight with Aboriginal people on the West Coast of Australia. And you can tell he's obviously a bit stroppy about it all. He describes them as the miserablest people on earth. I can still remember the phrase because it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But you can see echoes of that phrase in Cook's writings. Cook's clearly reading Dampier and thinking about Aboriginal people that he encounters in that way because he's read that and he's been predisposed to think of it that way. It's not like Cook has this, naturalised out of the blue encounter with people who never had contact with outside people. Whether they did or not is almost beside the point, because Cook certainly did have an encounter with those people in his mind.
Yes.
Beforehand.
Well, what sort of happened there? Because it was interesting that Dampier, I think he tried on the first trip to encounter them, but didn't, because he just saw smoke, right? And then in the second one, he was like, nah, screw it. This time I'm going to go ashore, I'm going to meet them, and I'm going to kidnap one of them and try and take them back to Great Britain, right? Why is it that he was so hell-bent on, I need to meet these people? And why were Europeans quite often really interested in kidnapping one or more of the locals? Why was that a goal?
Well, kidnapping is because if you could then get them to learn your language, they can then become the intermediary. So it's a ready-made cultural mediator. That's a very common practice for those European sailors. They would often take people for just that reason, quite an explicit purpose. Also bear in mind that this is a slave trading world at that time. So he might have been trying to suss out the possibilities there for making money from, people. He doesn't explicitly say that, but you've got to wonder if it's not in the back of his mind when they sort of do those sorts of things. It's
an interesting story. He gets on shore, right? And I think he sets up a trap to try and capture some of the Indigenous people but I think I'm not sure if you can tell it better from memory, but I think he realizes only later that they were kind of anticipating him screwing them around, and they had the upper hand, right?
Yeah, well, that's also quite common too. I mean, people from Europe often just assumed Aboriginal people, Indigenous people generally, were stupid.
You're on their home turf. You're on their home turf, man. Show a little respect.
Exactly. So they were always on to, they would have seen your boat coming weeks beforehand, or word would have got around what was going on, and they'd all be very wary. I mean, they would be hyper alert to this sort of encounter. So when Dampier tries to capture people, they end up throwing spears at him. His gunfight is a running retreat, really. When he does have that later conflict with them, I can't remember I must admit I can't remember all of the details.
I believe they had a young man who ends up getting captured by a bunch of them and is in a fight, and they're trying to kill him, and then Dampier rescues him, and they end up running back to the ship with their tail between their legs. But it was just a really interesting
scarpering away. Again, with Dampier, the thing I do remember really quite clearly, though, is Dampier writing himself as the action hero of the moment. Again, that's when you read these things, you've got to be wary about what really happened versus what someone like Dampier says happened. He's the only source for what was obviously a very complex and nuanced sort of encounter. Maybe written up on the day, but more likely written up, a day or so later when he finally had time to get to a bit of journaling, and then later modified again for publication, centering himself.
Well, it seemed really interesting too with people like Tasman getting to Tasmania and having these non-encounters, because I think you wrote that Tasman's stories influenced the story of Gulliver's Travel, right? The one where he's in the land of the giants. I believe. And
Gulliver's Travels is another one of those books that then gets taken by a lot of subsequent voyages. I think some of the French explorers of the later 18th century, are very fond of that as well. So you've kind of got this whole literary feedback as well, which has a whole other layer. Marco Polo is the classic example there. A lot of these people had read Marco Polo, at least the bits about China that interested them. And there you've got, a medieval writer whose work gets polished by a chivalric romance writer.
Yeah.
And which bits are history, which bits are literature, which bits are true, which bits are just targeting medieval prejudices, and then selectively being quoted by later ages complicates the prejudice. So it's all just this fascinating mix of how knowledge transfers down the ages is one of the things I was really interested in throughout.
Do you think a lot of these people, when they did have interactions, they were disappointed with what they came across because of that prejudice that they were set up to, believe, because of the stories that came back and had been kind of like, there's cannibals everywhere, and they're, they eat dirt and they barely live, they've completely sensationalized it. So do you think that a lot of the French and Cook and Arthur Phillip and those explorers to come and have significant interactions with the first Indigenous people, in Australia and New Zealand, do you think they were somewhat disappointed, or they were like, ooh, this doesn't seem like what I had in mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most famous example perhaps is the first fleet coming after Cook, and he's written about how wonderful it is and look at all this lovely land that could be turned to pasture or something like that. And then, the next lot turn up and they're like, oh, it's not quite as good as it sounded, is it? He kind of presented it as a ready-made farming land.
Yeah. Well, he arrived there when it was in flood, right, at Botany Bay, and then the other guys come when it's, obviously not in flood, and the place is a fly-infested swamp.
Yeah, so he arrived in Botany Bay in April, wasn't it? And then the first fleet's rocking up in January. It's the difference between a Sydney autumn and a Sydney summer is pretty harsh.
Yeah.
And so, that example is just one of many where that sort of thing happens, where people describe the wonders that are to be found and then other people find nothing. Or sometimes the reverse. Sometimes places are described as being not much chop, and then, the next person might find water, for instance, and then it becomes extremely useful for these shipping voyages as they need a place to replenish.
They were some of the main reasons, right? What were the motivations for people to try and come in contact with Indigenous people locally? Was it things like plundering, resources, trade, as well as capture and kidnapping? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, this is what I came up with a phrase for it: campsite colonialism. these early explorers, particularly the later ones, 17th, the 18th, 19th century ones, they liked ready-made replenishment stations. So they liked to turn up and have the locals sell them fresh fruit and vegetables for some, red cloth sort of thing. They needed a supply of fresh water. They liked fresh meat as well if they could get it. A lot of this is prejudiced from their encounters in Tahiti, where English and French ships had these sorts of encounters and saw it as a useful station, basically, for replenishing your voyage of exploration. And Cook in particular does this in New Zealand in a really big way, because at Tahiti, he picks up Tapaya, who, because of the similarities of language between Tahitian and Māori, when Cook arrives in New Zealand, Tapaya can communicate with the Māori.
That blew my mind. Because it's what the Maori got there 1,000 years ago. I don't know how soon after Tahiti was colonized by the Polynesians that they moved on to the Maoris. But imagine that, taking someone from Tahiti to New Zealand over such a large distance, and they can communicate with the same language. You'd be like, man, struck gold.
Yeah, and he did. And so Cook spends infinitely more time in New Zealand than he does in Australia. He goes back there again. So his 3 voyages, he's constantly going back to the north of the South Island, because it's a replenishment station for him. He knows the people there. He starts to have relationships with them. He can communicate with them, and it's a mutually useful arrangement in a way, because Cook can be used with his ship and his guns can be used to help sort of resolve local conflicts to the advantage of the person who's selling him the fresh stuff. And in Australia, that doesn't really work out for him. For the most part, but they do come back to Tasmania a couple of times. Cook comes to Adventure Bay twice. Well, Cook doesn't. Cook comes once, but his voyages come on multiple occasions, and that's the same spot that the French come. And you can see basically how Australia started to become one of these replenishment stations, perhaps not with the same degree of Indigenous collaboration or consultation engagements that you would have in somewhere like Tahiti or New Zealand, but nonetheless, that plundering of local resources is for that wider strategic purpose of taking European voyages further and further into the region. And I think that's one of the conceptual keys to what's going on in that later period just before the first fleet arrived in Australia. The first fleet is really the attempt to create one of those stations by plonking people on the east coast for the British to give them that sort of an advantage.
What was the Indigenous people's interpretation of those encounters in places like Adventure Bay? Because I believe in Adventure Bay, at least, they were years apart, right? It wasn't like they were coming every single year and dropping by and saying g'day and forming really good relationships. Even when they did interact with Indigenous people, it was more, we come once a decade or something, right? But how would they have interpreted white people arriving on ships on the mainland and with that, to complicate the question, were they just innocent bystanders who had no interests or motivations of their own, the Indigenous people there, or did they have certain we're gonna try and get what we can out of these people?
The short answer is we don't know, because they're such few and far between encounters, and they're pretty light on, so they're pretty small encounters. We just don't know. We don't have the details. We can make all sorts of guesses about what they likely did. Of course, they will have had their own agendas insofar as, to do that, you sort of have to assume that it's the same group having the multiple encounters, so at least the knowledge can get passed down through multiple generations. And we know from the point of colonisation onwards, aggressive settlement in Tasmania, that some Indigenous people could remember early encounters, early voyages. But what they made of it, what they did with it, is really, really hard to say in that early phase. And I think it's one of those areas where the historian's wiser to try to say little rather than make too many assumptions.
Try to cover your bases, huh? Come on, man. Come on, make some big conjectures.
Well, I really don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, they're so fleeting. The French encounters in Tasmania, I keep talking about Tasmania not because I'm living here, but because it's the only really good multi-contact area in the late period that we're talking about, where you've got French, you've got the Dutch arrive and they don't meet anybody, but then you have the English and the French have multiple encounters So they turn up a lot in the 1770s, and they are really rich sources for understanding a bit of what was going on here. But that being said, they're very varied encounters. In Bruny Island, Cook has what seems to be quite a pleasant encounter with a group of Aboriginal people there in the exchange of gifts and so on. But only a few years before that, you had the French firing on people and having them throw stones at the French from a cliff, like a really violent encounter on the east coast, a bit further up the coast. Now, that's far enough away that you could say, well, they might be two different groups who are enemies and don't have any contact with each other, but it's also close enough that maybe they did have enough of a contact. And, with something so weird happening, the only analogy you could think is like aliens arriving in New South Wales and then nobody telling Victoria. It's hard to believe that would happen.
Especially in today's day and age.
Yeah. Well, the borders will be shut. So it's really, really hard to say. Based on what they did, in New Zealand, for instance, where you've got lots and lots of encounters and a bit of documentation about what, at least what Māori people said to the Tahitian person who said to the person writing the journal, you've got some way of mediating some of that contact, or even where you don't have that, the way they behave can sometimes tell you what they're thinking. If they're weird, if they're wary, if they show signs of trading, or if they just run away straight away.
Yeah.
In Australia, there just seems to generally be this sort of wariness, by and large, because of the lack of a cultural mediator. They don't have somebody who can stand in the middle and say, well, you guys do this and you guys do that. So it's a much blunter encounter where you can just read how they feel based on their activities. The most famous, of course, being Cook at Endeavour River on the coast of Queensland, where he's camped there for a while, and you have Aboriginal people coming and looking at the boat, and so there's this kind of friendly, inquisitive encounter, which I think would be expected, and then the Aboriginal people try to take, or at least push off, some of the turtles that the English have put on their ship, because turtles are great food for voyages. They're ready preserved, they don't move, they're not going to run away. Well,
they needed to stock up, right? So they were out of food and they were like, man, we need to stock up. And I think they had 12 turtles or something that they'd caught over a few days. And the Aboriginals were like, well, no one owns anything. So if you've got some, I should have some, because that's our sharing, law, right?
Yep. So, but even then, is it a question of, no, you can't take the turtles, so you're just pushing them off, or you've got to share the turtles, in which case we're taking our share. We don't even know if that's that sort of distinction. And then within a few days, they're lighting fires around the camp, and they're obviously wanting them to go away. So it's only when it's that most extreme behaviour can you really be clear, I think, as to what's going on. The rest of the time, it's just this very vague, we just starting to get to know each other. It's like a weird, long first date sort of thing.
It seems so interesting too how the Indigenous people in Australia was so much more evasive. I guess they're not the Maori warrior types to stand their ground quite often, though. And because I don't know if because they're more nomadic, they're much more comfortable just being like, oh, fuck it, we're off, we'll go somewhere else. There's people coming here, we'll just go to another place and light a fire and let them know we're off, in the distance here, and we'll come back later and see what's happened.
It seems to vary a lot. So up in the north of Cape York, there are big fish battles.
Yeah.
The distinction, in a way, we're prejudiced because of the whole New Zealand Wars thing, and we think about Maori warriors, perhaps a bit with that 19th century prejudice still. But the reality is, Aboriginal culture is very diverse, and their reactions are very diverse. So on the west coast, where the population is smaller, they can't really risk big battles in the same way. So they would obviously be more evasive. On the north coast, the northern regions, they're very dense, very, at times, quite warlike, happy to fight for their country and push them off. It also depends on who is being encountered. So some of those Cook ones, for instance, if you look closely at, who's running away, well, it's a woman and a couple of children who are running away. So the encounter is with a small foraging party, which is not quite the same thing as, that famous one where Cook arrives and there's two guys on the beach with spears and shields, basically, pretty obviously telling him to go away. We don't want you. It's much more hostile sort of reception that he gets there. So it depends on the place, the people, and the makeup of the community.
It is phenomenal how different it is. You want to talk about the differences between how women and children were presented to explorers or not compared to Tahiti?
Yeah, well, Tahiti's famously, I mean, we get that through the French lens very much. They have a very openly sexualised society. How much of that is true? How much of that is frustrated sailors' prejudice? How much of that is prudish, proto-missionary sort of commentary? We're always a little wary of saying. But in Australia, again, because of the lack of communication, you don't really get that trading in women that you sometimes see through the writings of the European people who are the receiving end of that.
But not even that, they hide them, right? So pretty much, I think for the first, several hundred years, the Europeans don't even see women, right? Because the men have pretty much always sent them away. And it's just the men on a beach pretty much saying, either, we'll trade with you or get out of here.
Yeah. Well, again, it's potentially part of a patriarchal culture. It could also be that because the Europeans are arriving with boatloads of men.
True. So I wonder what they want.
How much of that is cultural predisposition or just thinking on the go? It's again really it's really hard to say, and I think that's one of the things that Australian history does need to be more open with. Sometimes you read these books and people come up with very firm answers. They think if you read all 5 explorers' journals of the one encounter, you're going to come up with the truth somehow.
Yeah.
And at best, you're going to come up with your own sort of maybe well-informed suppositions, but suppositions nonetheless. And it could simply be as simple as, well, you've got a boatload of men getting off the beach. Well, so obviously it's a man's encounter. Perhaps. We just don't know.
I guess finishing up, can we talk a bit about what happened with Monsieur Marion and the crew of the Adventure over in New Zealand? Because that seemed to be some of the really interesting stuff in the book. I had no idea that cannibalism was such a big thing with Maoris, right?
Yep.
Can you tell us a story there? What happened with them?
I can't remember the full details, but I can tell you that he was eaten.
All right, so Marignon, the French guy, was eaten, but the Adventure crew seems to be a really interesting encounter with a chief called Kahura, right? And I wanted you to talk about it because it showed the difference. One, it showed this really interesting cultural practice of cannibalism of your victims, the people you kill in war, but also the difference between the tribes of Maoris and their interactions with the Europeans.
Yeah, New Zealand. I mean, I love New Zealand history. My partner's a Kiwi, and so I'm always fascinated by how rich that early history is. You don't just have a sense like you do often in Australia. It's I will admit it's changing. It's fortunately changing quite a lot. But for a long time, Australian history was just the Aboriginal people and the Europeans. It was the white man and the black man. It's very binary. In New Zealand, there's always been a strong sense of the different kapapa, the different Māori tribes. And right from the earliest encounters with Cook, you can get that sense. And so with that encounter, it's Bernie, I seem to remember, who wrote that one up.
Yeah.
You basically have cannibalism's about taking power from the person that you've consumed, and it's a long-standing cultural practice, and you do it to your enemies. But the Europeans are horrified, and so they have this profound fascination with it, and they want to find it out, seek out what was done, find the people and punish them. And so in that encounter, those sorts of encounters, you can see an interesting insight into local Māori politics between different groups and how that they are playing themselves. They are playing the Europeans off for their own advantage against their traditional enemies. I mean, they don't have. We see things with the benefit of hindsight, so we know that the Europeans were going to move in a big way, and by the 1840s, New Zealand would be administered from New South Wales, and in the 1860s and 70s, New Zealand, the British Empire would send regiments from India to make sure that the local Māori did what they were told, and they would pass laws to take away land from them, all sorts of things, much as with Australia. We have that hindsight, but at the time, they didn't. These boats, they might have been new, but they were, every couple of years, one of these boats would turn up. so they took advantage of it for local political purposes. And it's just fascinating to get that insight into how, while the Europeans are developing these campsites for colonial purposes, the Maori themselves are using the colonists to advantage. Ultimately, of course, to Cook's great disadvantage when, he, by rumour, gets consumed, probably because he's seen as
spoiler alert
in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So it's just part of that richness of encounter, I think.
Well, so what happened exactly with the 10 crew members from the adventure that I think they had gone off looking for trade or something with, trying to find water or something in one of their smaller boats?
It's like a CSI story. You can only really work out what happened based on what you find later. And what you find later...
That was beautiful, right? The fact that they didn't find out for years, right? Cook finds out later, I think, as you say.
Yeah, so you find body bits, and which tell you a story about a fishing expedition that didn't end well. And then later on you get the stories, the testimony that sort of fleshes that out. Not a bad pun, but... that gives you the detail of
the context,
sort of what happens. And the context is basically a small group, a small expedition from the major, like a rowboat full of guys, runs afoul of Maori people, gets defeated and consumed, or at least partly consumed. And then it's that retrospective gaze which gives you the detail, which is, again, another one of the reasons I really like that story and wanted to include it, because it tells you about the writing of history. These guys are writing their own histories as they do, and that's all slowly coming together based on that.
Well, I found it's so fascinating that the chief leader who orchestrated that, that fight, because it seemed like from the book that originally the story was told that these Maoris came out and just massacred these guys, and then later they hear stories from other members of the different tribes saying no, that they were trading, or there was some sort of an encounter, and then something went wrong where one of the white guys took back something that the Maori had taken out of their boat or something, and then after that they didn't have access to their guns, right? They had like one musket, and the Maoris were just like, you're toast, and just knocked them all on the head, killed them all. And then, I think the chief leader from my memory of the book ends up meeting Cook, Kahura, and telling him that story and just being like, yeah, well, that's what happened, and Cook lets him go and doesn't kill him, right? So that blew my mind that Cook had the sort of understanding at the time too of, obviously there are going to be these kinds of interactions where they're going to go south on both sides, and he had the compassion to let this guy who just said, I killed 10 of your crew members and we ate them, and lets him go, because he understands that's kind of the I guess I'm thinking he understands that's just it was a miscommunication and that's what happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, Cook was quite an experienced voyager at that point, so he certainly understands that there are local traditions and rules and regulations and politics that he could never fully understand and certainly can't dictate to. It's helped produce an image of Cook as a very restrained sort of fellow, perhaps a little bit undeserved, because in the context he has guns and he has ships and so on, but he's incredibly outnumbered.
Yeah,
and the Maori are not bad sailors at all themselves either. They in a short run in those coves that we're talking about, it wouldn't be hard for him to be greatly overwhelmed if somebody took it into their head to do so. So there's a bit of real politic there, I think, as well. In terms of how Cook addresses these things, he knows that some things he just has to let slide because he has no other option really, and so he just tries to do so as graciously as an Englishman can in such circumstances.
All right. Well, finishing up, what was the biggest thing you got out of researching this book? The information that you found that wasn't out there before about Indigenous lives before or during the sort of long period that was eventual colonisation of Australia.
Well, starting from the back, I think it was when I clicked onto that campsite colonialism thing as a crucial element in the structural colonisation of this whole region. And that sort of blew my mind when I realised that they're going back to the same places again and again for colonial purposes, because it helps them to explore further in terms of the European project. So that in itself, to me, was a really important realisation. In terms of the European Aboriginal exchange, I think that echo down history of those earlier encounters. So some of them, even though they're well documented, didn't have a big impact because they weren't famous in their own day. So the Nick Brodie stuff, I loved that Spanish stuff. And it's rich. You know, they've got this 17th century manuscript in Sydney. It's just awesome to be working with something like that. But it didn't really make waves because it sat quietly in an archive for a long time. Whereas someone like Tasman or Dampier, because their discoveries were made famous through publication, they then have a much bigger impact on the way that people like Cook thought about Australia and the people living in Australia, and therefore how they interacted with them. You know, Cook knew that Dampier's one ended up in a firefight, so he was never going to arrive without his guns drawn.
Yeah.
It was always going to be a semi-military approach to the continent for that reason. So understanding the way that each telling of history has influenced the subsequent story of history, I think is probably one of the most interesting things, especially in light of how Indigenous history is so fraught in many ways in Australia. It's moving forward in leaps and bounds in some respects with lots of new research, but it's also constantly falling back into these traps of having the same arguments about the same things. And in some respects, we've been having those arguments since the 1640s.
Do you think that a big problem is how we refer them to? Because, you know, before I started really looking into it, my view is, you know, Australia's got Indigenous people. They're all one group. They're Indigenous people. Yeah. Is that a big problem with our understanding of, you know, Australia's history?
Yeah, certainly. The idea that all Aboriginal people are the same and have always been the same and will always be the same is a big problem. You know, there are very big differences. The people in Tasmania were separated for 10,000 years from those in mainland Australia. The people of Torres Strait are not the same culturally as those in northern mainland Australia, and they're certainly not the same as those in the Sydney region or in South Australia in the Desert Territory. You know, each group has their own names and their own stories and their own histories, and if we try to treat them as one big monolithic block, then it's going to distort the picture. And that's where I think, again, broadening out the geography makes it impossible to do that. You know, if you start to include New Zealand and Papua in the history of Australasia, then you can't fall into that trap quite so easily of thinking of Aboriginal people as all the same, because Indigenous people are not all the same.
Well, it'd be as absurd as saying, yeah, Europeans, you know, they're all the same. They all speak the same language, same culture, all the same.
Yep, and that's the thing now. You can start to see that through some histories where people who aren't Europeanists and don't understand European history and its nuances start to write about Europeans, you know, the way that there's a Western mindset in terms of the encounters within the Aboriginal people.
You're like, which one?
Exactly. They're just as diverse. So it's I think learning to re-engage with that richness and diversity and nuance and not having to have all the big one-size-fits-all answers is probably what I learned most from that whole project.
No worries. Well, Nick Brodie, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find out more about your books, especially, you know, give us a plug for the most recent work that you've just released.
The most recent work is Under Fire, How Australia's Violent History Led to Gun Control. It's just very topical, courtesy of the United States of America.
So and New Zealand, right?
Yeah, well, New Zealand, Canada. And they're all looking to us as to what we did in 1996. But what I did in that book is really to delve deep again and to kind of look at the long history of gun control. So that's the most recent one, which is out now. We've also got Kosciuszko, The Vandemonian War, 1787, and King.
Brilliant.
All good bookstores.
So yeah, you can get it from Amazon. Get online, man. You're in quarantine. You should be able to get these books sent to you.
Some of them on good specials online at the minute.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Nick. I'll have to have you on again in the future. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.